South African Airways has many hurdles to overcome before it's ready for private shareholders, not least its insolvency and regulation limitations. Media reports are suggesting that Ethiopian Airlines would consider a piece of SAA. Flyer magazine editor Guy Leach joining us now to talk more about this. Guy, joining us via Skype, I understand, this afternoon. Always a pleasure to speak to you, Guy. So Ethiopian Airlines, hailed as the best airline on the continent, why on earth would they be interested in the ailing SAA?
Yeah, hi, nice to be with you. It's an extraordinarily difficult question to answer because it is such an unlikely proposition. The real problem is that the current laws of South Africa limit foreign ownership of South African Airlines to just 25%, which means that an airline like Ethiopian, or for that matter Emirates, would only be able to own a minority shareholding in South African Airways. And that wouldn't give them the power to necessarily override government decisions, because the history of South African Airways, as indeed with SA Express, has been one of government interference, which is one of the reasons why the airline has struggled so much with profitability. I would feel that any airline that would want to come in and take a share in South African Airways would want operational control. And unless they change the laws very quickly, that's a real problem at this stage. But nonetheless, it needs to be pointed out that Ethiopian has already shown a successful track record in expanding into Africa, in taking over other struggling African airlines, most closely Malawian Airlines of all things, and a couple of airlines like Askai in West Africa. So it's not unlikely that Ethiopian will be interested in taking a share in South African Airways. It just depends under what terms.
You speak about Ethiopian Airlines expansion into other parts of Africa. I know they've got interests in expanding to Ghana. They're also eyeing Zambia as well. I'm wondering if you think a continental Africa airline would perhaps be the future of aviation on the continent.
Yes, very much so. I think that's a very astute observation. The problem with African airlines in Africa is that there are just too many of them. Unlike, for instance, the United States, where there really are just two dominant carriers, in Africa we've got as many as 54 different carriers across the 72 different states. And that makes it very hard for every individual carrier to achieve what you might think of as a critical mass that enables it to be big enough to compete with the other carriers that are coming in and literally eating up the African carriers' lunch. Here I'm talking about airlines like Turkish Airlines, which are increasingly moving into Africa. And then, of course, the so-called Gulf 3 or Middle East 3 airlines, Emirates, Qatar, and Emirates, which are coming in and increasingly using African routes that should be used by African airlines.
Let's move away from the money and talk about something else. You would have seen the weekend reports about that defective, if you will, Mango Airlines Boeing 737, I believe it was, that nosedived due to a faulty part, a part that, I'm trying to find the language used, a defective part is what it was called in those weekend reports. Is one such incident enough reason to have a greater concern or worry about the safety of Mango and SAA aircraft?
Normally it wouldn't be, because stuff happens. But in this case, there is a lot to be worried about, simply because the Civil Aviation Authority's report indicated that this part had been changed. It's a flight safety critical part, the stabilizer trim jack, had been changed on the 7th of August. So they replaced a part with a defective part. Now, that is not supposed to happen in aviation maintenance. One must know what is called the provenance or the history of every part that you put into an airline. You have to know that where it was made by the manufacturer. You have to know whether it's been used before, whether it's time expired, in other words, whether it's just be retired, whether it's defective. And it seems that this has fallen through SAA technical safety checks, which would mean that there might be problems with other safety checks. Now, if you read it in conjunction with that somewhat sensationalistic report in the Sunday Times, which talks about multinational conspiracies for pirate parts and so on, then there is even more concern, potential concern. The real issue here is not, is there a problem or not but that there needs to be no question about the safety of airlines. Otherwise, people will simply not trust them. We don't know whether there's a substantive issue. What we do know is that there are questions about those, and that in itself is not good enough. Our local Civil Aviation Authority, the SAA, must get a full investigation going as to whether there are pirate or time-expired parts in the South African Airways Technical Service inventory storerooms.
Lastly then, Guy, one of the angles that will get a lot of attention as SAA begins the investigation into this defect in the parts used on that Mango aircraft is the possible purchase of this particular part from a syndicate of some sort that sells these fake parts. Is that a particularly common thing in aviation?
Unfortunately, it's the endless problem in aviation. Well, it's not particularly common because thankfully most systems manage to stop this. But it's like, you know, if you like, it's like bookkeepers and cricket betting. You know, they're always on the outside trying to get in. And the moment controls elapse because of poor management controls or systems, well then these pirate operators get in. Because, you know, apart from Airbus or Boeing might cost $700, but you could buy it from $7 from a pirate maker who might have made it in Taiwan. So that is, you can see that the profits are almost like those of the rhino poachers. It is an enormously lucrative industry if you can bypass the checks and balances that the airlines must have.
Guy Leach, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.